Good morning and welcome. My name is David Jones, and on behalf of my esteemed colleagues Hazel, Colin and Celeste, I'm going to be talking about implications and questions for institutional learning analytics implementation from teacher DIY learning analytics. Throughout this presentation, we are going to make the connection or use the metaphor of institutional implementation of learning analytics as being somewhat equivalent to, or as if it's life within a ladies' correctional institution. As with any metaphor, there are some useful correlations, connections that can be used to highlight interesting things, but there is a danger that the metaphor can be taken too far. So in terms of an overview of the presentation, what we're trying to do here is we're focusing on a single case of teacher do-it-yourself learning analytics, a unique and somewhat different take on learning analytics. And from that particular case, we're hoping to draw some insights for the institutional implementation of learning analytics. And in particular, we're going to try to identify 3 separate implications and 3 questions about institutional implementation of analytics. And I'll just use ILA. The idea is that those 3 implications and questions provide new insights. They highlight particular areas around ILA that I think there are fruitful areas for further work. So why are we doing this? Largely because the institutional implementation of learning analytics is still very much underway and unresolved. This particular quote from Colvin, reporting on perhaps the largest empirical examination of ILA to date, observes that for most organisations, the institutional adoption of learning analytics is either just conceptual and unrealised. They're aspiring to do this sort of stuff, or if it is actually implemented, it's often very narrow and limited in its scope and impact, and particularly on learning and teaching and practices around teaching. Where there are conceptual models, and there are a number of them being offered to guide the implementation of learning analytics at an institutional level, they tend not to capture the full nuance or the finer detail. They're very abstract and not necessarily informed by experience of implementation. In terms of what empirical work has been done, it is tended to focus on the folk in charge of implementing and organising and running such implementation. So, for example, Colvin's work and colleagues looked at asking what senior leaders charged with the responsibility of implementing learning analytics thought about the experience and try to derive insight from what they were thinking. So they certainly have a valuable input or valuable insight, but they don't give the full picture, that they don't offer the full nuance, that there is an absence of other voices within that work. And in particular, we're interested in the voice of the teachers. Obviously, there are other voices, such as learners and a range of others that would be interesting and important. But in our particular context, we're going to be looking at what the teachers and what their experience of learning analytics is revealing. This absence of focus on the users is fairly well recognised within the literature. There have been quotes suggesting that learning analytics, particularly in implementation, lacks human centredness. It doesn't pay enough attention to where people are and what they need to do and how they are doing it. And there is a tendency for it to privilege the administrator rather than the student or the instructor, as has been highlighted by the empirical work to date has tended to focus on the administrator or the people in charge of implementation. So the research questions that we're interested in are along these lines. What is the experience of teachers using institutional learning analytics? And how might an understanding of what they are doing with those systems, those tools, inform how we institutions go about implementing learning analytics? What new and interesting insights might be available? Because we're taking a novel approach here, we're going to focus on a particular case of a single teacher and their experience with institutional learning analytics and what they've done in response to it. As a single case, as a single individual, that there is a limits to what you can say about generalisation here, but the idea is that we're trying to look for interesting and different insights that might guide the experience. And in terms to try to ameliorate that to some extent, the one teacher we're talking about is myself as the implementation, but the co-authors are also providing some questioning those perspectives, that experience, also offering different perspectives from their experience. So, for example, we've got two folk that are in central learning and teaching, and we've got another teaching academic who isn't technical, who isn't involved heavily with learning analytics at the moment, just to give that diversity of experience and perspective on the things and the experiences and the implications and the questions and the analysis that we're trying to perform from this particular case. So let's describe the case. So in this particular case, it's the experience in 2015 and 2016 in a third-year core course in a Bachelor of Education. It was a course that's taken by pre-service teachers, initial teacher educators from all sectors, so early childhood, primary, secondary and vet. In this particular course, it was offered twice a year. The first semester offering of the course, the large offering, had about 300 students, both online and on campus. About 200 students of that, about 2/3 of the students in that first semester are online only, and the remainder are spread across two separate campuses. In semester 2 offering, there are about 100 students and they are online only. So about 75% of the students, or a little bit more over the full year, are online only. And because of the campus distribution and the location, the lead teacher, the person in charge of running the course, designing it, will meet less than 15% of the students face to face. So the vast majority of the students never meet the lead teacher or the course examiner. The course itself is designed to make significant use of the online space, as you might expect with 2/3 of the students being online. A lot of effort has been put into designing the course and making use of digital technology. That's in part because the course itself is intended to demonstrate and help pre-service teachers develop their own abilities to integrate digital technologies into their teaching and to enhance and transform their students' learning. So with the combination of 75% online students and a focus on using digital technology to enhance and transform learning, the course has put a lot of effort into using the technology, particularly the online space, to transform learning. As a result, there are lots of questions asked on discussion forums, and this is an example of one in a particular forum around assignment 2. And this particular case, the students are asking that they're a little bit confused about an aspect of the assignment. They're not sure how they're going to answer that. So this is a question where you might expect a member of the teaching staff to respond. Now, to respond effectively to this particular question, it's important that it would be useful if the person responding, the teacher, had access to a range of information, such as where is this particular student located, because depending on the state of Australia they're located, the answer may be a little bit different. Whether they're an early childhood, a primary or a secondary teacher, because again, depending on that information, the answer will be different. How they've gone in their prior studies, what they've actually done, what they haven't done, just to get a gauge on the student's preparedness, and also their contact details, for example, their phone number. So if it was a question that was better answered via the phone, you want to get the phone number so you can answer that. Also, for this particular question, for this assignment, using some constructive alignment, the course actually has activities, tasks associated with this particular type of question, and so it'd be interesting to know whether or not the student has completed that particular learning task and what they've actually done around it, because that would again guide how you would respond. And lastly, in this course there's very specifically designed activities where students are expected to maintain and write regularly each week reflective blog posts on their own blog. So again, having some idea of how the student's going, on what they've written about in their blog posts, will provide some idea of what they're experiencing in the course, what they're struggling with, and provide just generally more insight into the type of information the teacher would need to respond to those to this particular question. Now this particular challenge resonates somewhat with what some folk have positioned as the purpose for learning analytics. So Baker's quote here, that the purpose of learning analytics, or good learning analytics, is of getting key information to a human being so that they can actually use it. So in this case, information about the learner and what they've done, so that the teaching staff member can respond appropriately. So learning analytics have been around for quite some time, particularly my institution has spent some effort on it. So what is my experience with using institutional learning analytics to answer the types of questions that we've just talked about as being useful? So at my institution, and noting that I'm a very computer literate person and I can use technology a lot quicker than perhaps isn't the norm, it takes me at least 10 minutes to answer those particular questions, and I need to draw on 6 separate reports and 2 separate institutional systems to gather all that information. And as an example, one of those reports looks like this. It doesn't actually fit on the browser. You actually have to scroll around her horizontally and being able to keep in line which student, which activity you want to do. So finding this information actually is quite difficult. So based on that experience of institutional learning analytics, the quote that perhaps resonates most with me is this from Don Norman, and it's the idea that when the affordances make something easy, they get done, but when the affordances make things difficult to do, so when it becomes difficult to find the answer, but more detail about an individual learner in response to their question, that information just isn't gathered, it isn't used, and so instead the teacher tends to respond to those questions in a generic way that's not necessarily responsive to where the student is and what they're up to. That's not a good thing. Which leads us to our first implication, and that is the idea that the institutional learning implementation of learning analytics is currently falling short. It's not achieving that goal of being able to provide information to a human who can use it. So noting the previous comment about the limited generalisability of an individual example, well, this particular example applies across a whole institution, and discussions with my co-authors and also relating to the literature reinforces that this particular experience is across the board. It's an unusual institution that doesn't have this particular problem, and you've got some literature here from Corin and from Lou that report the same thing, that simply put, teaching staff simply don't have the data in the place that they want, in a form that they need, where it can actually be used. And hence it's no surprise that institutional learning analytics at the moment isn't being used. So for those of you listening, if you considered your institution, how long would it take and what systems would be required to be used to answer the types of questions that have been outlined here? So that's a particularly inappropriate situation for me as somebody who's trying to do interesting and good stuff with learning and teaching online. And so rather than just make do with that and not respond in a personalised way to student questions, I went about implementing a form of learning analytics to help with this particular situation. So what did I do? So we'll go back to the original problem. The student has asked a question in a discussion forum. At this point in time, the information I need to answer that question isn't readily available. So we need to make it readily available. And so the tool that I've implemented modifies my view of the Moodle LMS, and wherever a student name is mentioned or a link to a student profile is mentioned, my tool will add a little link called details. And it just appears, and you can see it pointed to here. This little tool we've called Know Thy Student, and that's its basic purpose. It's to help me know the student and their learning so we can guide the way in which we respond to things. Now, if I click on that details link, I automatically get access to a pop-up window that shows me the personal details of that student. So this answers my questions of where they are, which state they're in, what sector. So for this particular student, you can see that they're studying a primary program, so they're a primary studying to become a primary teacher. I can have a look at their prior studies. They've completed 18 units, and I can also see a GPA indication. I can find out what postcode they're in, and where available, I can also see their phone number if I want to contact them straight away. Now, if I click on Activity Completion, which is another tab on this pop-up window, I get information about what learning tasks the student has done. So in this particular case, what I'm getting is I'm replacing this particular quite convoluted and difficult to use report with something that is specific to the student and to the course. And it looks like this. And what it does is it shows a long list of all the activities organised into the modules and the weeks for this course. It shows the details about when this particular week was going. So this is week 4. For Module 2, it was running from the 23rd of March to the 27th of March, which when I took this was 2 months ago. So I took this photo screenshot at the end of semester. And what I can see is each of the activities that are designed, the students are asked to complete. And one of those activities that the arrow is pointing to is selecting your criteria. Now, this particular activity is designed especially to help students select the criteria for their assessment, so it's directly related to the question that the student is asking. Against each of those activities, this particular view will show me when or if the student has actually completed it. So when I actually went in to have a look at this particular view in the semester while it was running, that particular student hadn't actually performed this particular activity. And you can see here that the previous task, Stage 2 assessment evidence, was completed 2 months ago. The following activity, a little quiz, and the little quiz is a formative piece of assessment to gauge how well the student has understood the previous activity. That was completed 2 months ago, but the resource selecting your criteria was only completed a month ago. So the student hadn't actually completed that activity. And so obviously that influences how you respond to that particular question for that student. They haven't done that activity, and you perhaps guide them to go and have a look. So lastly, another click to another tab, and it gives me to blog posts. And this shows me the list of all the blog posts that particular student has written, their title, the date when they've done that, and the colour coding here gives me an indication of the sentiment that is embodied within each of those posts. So the orange coloured blog post here indicates that this particular student, the language they were using in that post was a little bit less than positive. They weren't feeling very happy with themselves, whereas the ones that are green indicating they're a little bit more happier when they've written those types of things, or at least the language they've used indicates that. While it's not perfect, it does give me a better insight into what the students are expressing with that. And the way that this course is designed, this particular learning design is very explicit. There's no other course in my institution that's using this particular learning design. So this is unique to this course. With 300 students in first semester, each writing about 3 or 4 blog posts a week, teaching staff aren't reading all those blog posts, and students are told we're not reading all those blog posts, but they do provide an insight into what the student is experiencing. So that was implemented in 2015 and used in 2015 and 2016. So by a test by presence, that gives us the implication that it is possible for teachers to implement DIY learning analytics. So it's not impossible, it can be done. And this echoes a broad finding from the broader computer science and technology literature that actually posits that most of the programs that are written today are not being written by professionally trained software developers. They are instead being written by people with expertise in other domains, in this case learning and teaching, that have a particular goal or a need. And in my case, it was finding out more about my students. And to do that, I needed computational support, so I've written some programs to do that. Now, because of my background, I'm able to write those programs in a different way than a lot of people, but there are other ways you can do it, and there are a lot of people who are doing this sort of thing. So teacher DIY learning analytics is possible. And in fact, there's a vast amount of literature that talks about this sort of stuff and calls them shadow systems and feral systems in the broader organisational context. And one perspective, particularly from central IT folk, is that these types of systems are deemed to have negative consequences because they undermine official systems, or they sap resources and duplicate things, and that's seen as being inefficient and inappropriate. But at the same stage, from the perspective of the users, they are seen as being the only way, really, in some cases, of actually having effective and efficient ways of engaging and performing tasks with computational support. They are generally done because of the deficiencies of formal systems, in particular formal systems that aren't going to cater to the specific needs of the individual user. Now, in my particular example, we've implemented teacher DIY learning analytics, and demonstrably the affordances to find that information and find those answers are much easier than using the institutional system. Echoing Norman's quote that, well, if the affordances make things easy to do, they should be apt to get done. So the question here is, well, given that this information is easy to get access to, was it actually used? So we'll look at some analytics around the use of this analytics tool, and this data is taken from 4 offerings of the course from 2015 and 2016. Overall, there are 850 unique students enrolled in those 4 offerings of the course. Now, what this particular graph shows is that each of those lines represents a student for which a Know Thy Student was used. So there's a 761 lines there, which represents 90% of the students. What that suggests or shows is that I've clicked on the details link for Know Thy Student for 90% of the students enrolled in those 2 years. So this suggests that this isn't just the failing students, it's the broad spectrum of students across all of this course. There is one particular spike there, and that particular student was used during the testing phase of implementing the tool. That's why there's a lot more clicks for that particular student than for others. And as a side note, I am planning that this particular graph will be modified so that it'll colour code for or even be organised by grade distribution, so we can get some insight into that. So that's for the number of students. In terms of daily usage, this calendar heat map shows that for each particular day over those 2 years, the number of clicks on Know Thy Student, the number of times Know Thy Student was used by myself. So this is only myself using it. It was only available to me as the lead author. And what it shows there, if you do the stats, is that I used Know Thy Student for 666 days over those 2 years, which equates to basically 91% of the days over those 2 years. And that extends a little bit before and a little bit after when semesters are actually done. The most I used it on a single day was 140 times. And you can see some correlations there. There are particular dates where it's particularly heavy, and those tended to coincide with assignment due dates. You can also see that the usage in semester 2 is a lot lighter than in semester 1, and that's basically an artefact of there being a third less students in semester 2 than there were in semester 1. Now, a lot of that use was emergent use. A lot of that use wasn't solely from trying to respond to discussion forums. Because of the way that Know Thy Student was implemented, it became embedded and ubiquitous across Moodle. So Moodle is a student-centered tool, and so across a range of different areas, just not the discussion forum, it will actually try to show you the details of students who are viewing, or looking at, or engage with a particular activity. This particular slide shows on the homepage the way that Moodle is set up at our institution. It will show you the list of online users, people who have been on the course recently, and it includes details of students. And because of the way Know Thy Students works, whenever it sees a student detail or anybody's details really, it adds a details link. Because it was embedded and ubiquitous, and because this was showing up, what I found myself evolving into was that when I logged onto the course site, I would see those online users, and I would look at who was there. And now, because it was easy for me to actually find out more information about them, if I didn't recognise a name that of a student I hadn't talked to before, or if I recognised the student's name who I knew was having particular problems or was asking particular questions, I would then, coming into the course site, find myself clicking on the details link just to get an update on where they're up to and what they're doing, what they're writing about, just to check in to see what's going on, either on their progress or to see whether or not the student was engaging with the course and maybe needed some extra prompting or anything else that I could do to improve things. And that leads us to implication number 2, and that's the idea that when learning analytics are embedded, ubiquitous and contextual, so they're embedded within the learning environment, all across the learning environment, easy to access, and they are contextual, because this learning analytics, Know Thy Student was designed specifically for my course and the learning designs, that seems to encourage usage both in quantity and quality, hopefully, but also is emergent practice. And that echoes some literature from the learning analytics literature, is about the better the quality of the information, the contextual nature of the information provided to the humans, the better that means for their use. And that highlights a particularly important aspect, is that what we know about learning and teaching is that context is very important. We know that one size does not fit all, that there is no one solution that applies to every teacher, every course, and every view of learning and teaching. We need to be able to respond. Most of the tools that are provided to us in terms of lecture theatres, in terms of LMS, in terms of learning tools, are generic. They're not catered to the particular needs of a particular course or a particular learning design. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of what teachers do is bricolage, both in the online space and also in the physical space. And there's a long literature around that a lot of what teachers do is bricolage. They're making use of what's to hand to customise, to modify what's going on, to suit the learners and the learning that they're trying to encourage. And so there is certainly work from Hatton where using the idea of a bricoleur and bricolage are very useful and interesting ways to understand and explain teachers' work. There's also work around technology-enhanced learning, which suggests that the innovation around the use of technology in learning and teaching is actually a process of bricolage. It's not about big upfront design. It's about making use of what's available and responding to that. And that's an example of what My Teacher DIY is about. It's about a bricoleur doing some bricolage, using the knowledge and the context and the tools that they have to hand to respond and to customise their learning and teaching. A lot of teachers do this in face-to-face classes, but there have been a number of observations that teachers aren't able to do this in the online space. So the Horizon report has long identified the low digital fluency of faculty as being a significant challenge, impeding the adoption of technology in higher education. So that does raise the question about whether or not engaging in this type of DIY learning analytics is something that a lot of teachers can do. One of the arguments or one of the interesting perspectives on that is, well, the environment within higher education at the moment, particularly the digital environment within higher education at the moment, doesn't actually make it easy for people to engage in bricolage, doesn't make it easy for people to engage in this sort of customisation. And also, arguably, if you have a look at the institutional learning analytics in my institution, those tools doesn't actually make it easy for people to adopt those learning analytics because they're not very useful. So it may well be that it's not necessarily the limited digital fluency alone that's limiting adoption of this. It may be that the environment and the tools themselves don't satisfy, don't suit, aren't encouraging and aren't enabling this type of thing. And certainly as somebody who is a digitally fluent academic, my experience is that the environment in higher education, particularly the digital environment, just doesn't know how to handle digitally fluent faculty. It isn't providing the affordances, the technologies, the platforms that digitally fluent people want, and hence it's probably not providing the scaffold or the observable innovations that enable other academics to be aware that they can actually engage in bricolage and become bricoleurs and do DIY learning analytics. Which brings us a segue from our three implications into the three questions we have for DIY learning analytics. Whenever I know those student to academics or to people who are involved with learning analytics, the first question they ask is, well, how can we take that particular tool and use it in our context? It's the idea of we're going to scale we're going to do the good thing by taking what you've done and plonking it down in our context, and everything will just work from there. And this brings up our first question for learning analytics, and that's whether or not institutional learning analytics has an incomplete focus. These quotes here show that scaling is a particular issue for learning analytics, particularly at the institutional level. We're moving away from small-scale research, like me doing my own thing, to trying to find learning analytics implementations or interventions that can be used across the institution. We want everybody to make use of this. And to quote from Lon, making the leap from the focus and the particular to the broad and the general. But there's actually a known problem around making that particular focus, and it's been identified both in the learning objects literature and also in the learning analytics literature. Gazovic and co-authors identifies a significant tension between this course-specific and general models of learning analytics. And the idea is that the generalised models may represent a cost-effective and an easy way to implement something that can be used across the institution, but because it's so divorced from the specific course context, it actually doesn't get used in all of the different contexts because it's not specific to the particular context. Implementing boutique or specific models is very hard. Certainly at the moment it's hard because it's unwieldy to implement a specific set of analytics tools for every context, for every learning design. So the problem with the institutional implementation at the moment is that there is a tendency to focus on reuse, and as they make it easier for reuse to happen, they're actually reducing the pedagogical value. So by making it easier to reuse something across the institution, it appears that they are limiting or reducing the ability for it to actually be adopted and used effectively. And this echoes from the reusability paradox from learning objects. And it also echoes what we know about learning and teaching is that nothing works everywhere. One size does not fit all. So that's the limited focus of learning analytics. It's so focused on going to scale, it's not paying enough attention to the specific. The next question is that whether institutional learning analytics has a starvation problem, and it's related. Because they're focused so much on something that can be used by everybody, they're not interested in providing something that can be used by an individual course or an individual learning design. requests for specific, course-specific or learning design-specific analytics implementation has to go in the priority queue belong everybody else, and that priority queue is such that the things that are higher priority, the things that can be used by more people, by more courses, are more likely to be implemented. The trouble is that ends up starving of attention the specific, and it's the specific stuff that actually we think will probably be used more and more effectively, whereas the generic isn't going to be used all that effectively. So the example of that is something very specific in terms of learning design or learning analytics, is like the blog sentiment analysis. Certainly at my institution, if I was waiting for the institutional IT folk to implement that, it would simply never get done, and the idea is it probably would never get done at any other institution. So the last question we have is, well, if and how do we enable teacher DIY learning analytics? You can probably figure out that from my argument is that institutional learning analytics is currently falling short of an important goal. We know that embedded, ubiquitous, contextually specific learning analytics are going to be used more in terms of quantity and quality, and it's also going to enable emergent use. We know that teacher DIY learning analytics is possible. We know that ILA has an incomplete focus, and there is a starvation problem. So it appears that teacher DIY learning analytics does have a place if we can only figure out how we can implement it. And actually just going on a little bit further, the broader literature from the technology-enhanced learning literature is that it's actually important that we enable user-driven contributions from both teachers and students, because that's going to be a necessary condition to properly understand the details, the context, and to be able to respond appropriately. So having that, I've answered the first part there. I think talking from my co-authors and I, we've answered the question of if. It seems to be a really good idea. The question now is how do we go about doing this? And so there are some ideas, there are some steps towards this within the existing literature. So the work of Danny Liu and Abelardo Pardo around some of the tools that they're implementing at the moment recognise that teachers need a platform that they're able to engage with data at scale. They've used participatory design, they've implemented things that are teacher-centred, human-centred, and with a focus on customisability and flexibility. And there are some good things coming with those particular tools. But at some level, those tools don't necessarily go far enough. They don't appear to offer a generative platform, using the words of Zittrain, something that allows unprompted change. So both the on-task tool and the SRES tool from Liu enables people to be creative and engage in some DIY stuff within the constraints of the tool. It doesn't allow them to develop and extend and further the tool themselves. They have to be coordinated. So, and there is literature from the information systems field that suggests that pervasive digital technologies, so it's rather than these separate unconnected digital technologies we've had for years, but now the digital technology is increasingly becoming pervasive and embedded within our life, it's more important that, to produce innovations that are characterised by generativity. So that's the current and the future, but if you go back almost 40 years, the origins of the personal computer was such that it was based on the idea that being able to anticipate all the designs, which is essentially what we're trying to do with institutional learning analytics, we're trying to design something for everybody. In the words of Alan Kay, is going to result in a disastrous feature-laden hodgepodge, not really suitable for anybody, which echoes with the current experience with most people with institutional learning analytics. And Alan Kay certainly had the idea for the Dynabook was that to provide systems that would enable ordinary users to casually and easily describe what they needed from a specific tool and actually implement those sorts of tools. So we're interested now in exploring how we can enable DIY teacher learning analytics by providing sorts of platforms that allow end users to easily engage with this type of work. It's going to be incredibly difficult to do this because at the core of this is a completely different mindset. The idea that academics can actually engage in and design their own learning analytics is something that most people in central IT, most learning analytics literature, particularly those with the impression of academics as having low digital fluency, they just can't do. It's also challenging the efficient use of technology where you have lots of people doing different things rather than an institution doing the one thing. There are concerns about scalability. even the academics themselves have a deficit model of their own abilities. And so there is that need to shift a mindset from, no, I can't do that, I'm not that type of person, to helping them see that, no, actually it is possible, it can be something that's done. And if there is the support and the scaffolds to enable it. Shifting those mindsets is perhaps the more difficult aspect of this challenge of implementing teacher DIY learning analytics. The technical side is a little bit easier. In terms of theoretical inspiration for design, there's a range of literature talking about tinkering, principles for tinkering, tailorable technology design, and also creating computationally rich learning environments. There's a lot of principles can be drawn from that. In terms of modern technologies and modern approaches, there is a lot of work being done in the reproducible research sphere, particularly because universities are engaging in reproducible research in their own research. It seems like a good idea to try to embed some of that same technology into learning analytics and into teaching. And some of those ideas are around literate computing, version control and virtualization, particularly when combined with web augmentation, seem to provide a simple way to implement some of the ideas that we've already done with Know Thy Student. So, in summary, we've looked at the case of a particular teacher who's implemented some learning analytics by himself. From that experience with institutional learning analytics implementation, we've drawn 3 implications and 3 questions. In particular, those seem to suggest that helping support academics engage in DIY learning analytics seems to hold some value in addressing issues and problems with institutional learning analytics. And that's going to be our next focus.